The morning started like any other, calm and predictable, the type of morning you barely notice because it feels routine. You arrived early, placed your bag on your desk, organized your notes, and prepared for what you believed would be a standard performance review. There was no rush in your steps and no anxiety in your chest. You had spent years building a reputation for consistency, discipline, and patience. For someone over 37, you had reached a stage of life where you did not panic at every calendar notification. You understood routine. You understood preparation. That was why the invitation for a review did not cause worry. If anything, you expected a discussion about the new training modules you had designed, or perhaps a conversation about the budget proposal you had submitted. You certainly did not expect what was waiting on the other side of that conference room door. The hallway felt colder than usual as you walked toward the meeting. You noticed details you normally ignored. The way two junior analysts avoided your eyes. The subtle way the HR assistant moved her laptop as you passed. The silence around the break room where there was usually chatter. At your age and with your experience, you had developed an instinct for atmosphere. Something was off. Something in the air had changed. But you kept walking because you believed in professionalism, and professionalism meant showing up regardless of the tone around you. When you opened the conference room door, you immediately felt the weight of the atmosphere. Four managers sat at the table, each looking down at their papers. The CEO sat at the head. He did not nod or greet you. He barely acknowledged you. That alone told you the script had already been written, and you were simply walking into a performance none of them had the courage to personalize. You took your seat with the quiet composure that comes from maturity, not weakness. You placed your notebook gently on the table and straightened your back, ready to listen, ready to speak, ready to review the work you had spent months building. But the CEO did not invite a discussion. He did not ask questions. He did not show interest. Instead, he reached for a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table as if you were a number, not a person. His voice was flat as he delivered a cold summary. He claimed your training budget results were unacceptable. He added that the company no longer considered your role justifiable. He uttered the verdict with a tone that suggested finality, not dialogue. No one else spoke. No one offered context. No one explained how a respected employee had suddenly become a burden. The room was filled with avoidance, and in that moment, you understood the truth that only people who have lived long enough can decode. This was not about performance. It was about something they were trying to hide. You felt heat rise in your chest, not as shame, but as clarity. People who have reached a certain age understand the difference between guilt and insight. You felt no guilt because you knew your work had been thorough. You knew your records were precise. You knew the training initiatives you built had saved money rather than wasted it. What you felt instead was a sharp understanding that the decision was not rooted in logic. All your questions about unusual expenses, vague vendor invoices, suspicious approvals, and inflated training costs suddenly connected like pieces of a puzzle you had not realized you were assembling. Your insistence on transparency had made you inconvenient. They did not want an employee with a backbone. They wanted a silent signature. You looked around the table, searching for a trace of honesty, but all you saw were lowered eyes. The managers avoided your gaze because they knew what this was. They were following instructions, not evaluating your work. They were pretending not to notice the inconsistencies. They were pretending not to notice the sudden hostility that began the moment you questioned the new allocations. You had seen these patterns before in other environments. People who do not want accountability create a story before the conversation even begins. You folded the paper calmly, placed it in your notebook, and stood with the dignity of someone who understood their value. The CEO still did not look at you. He moved on to the next topic, as if dismissing you as a technical chore. The managers remained silent. The HR representative who had been sitting in the corner typed quickly, avoiding any interaction. At 37 and beyond, you learned to recognize moments that reveal the true character of a workplace. This was one of those moments. They had chosen expedience over integrity, and they assumed you would accept it quietly, because that was what convenient victims do. You walked out of the room with a straight back, your steps measured and calm. Your mind replayed the conversation not with sadness, but with a growing understanding. This was not a loss. This was a signal. It was a sign that you had asked the right questions. It was evidence that you had touched a nerve. It was confirmation that you were closer to the truth than they expected. As you made your way to the elevator, several employees glanced at you, some with sympathy, others with fear. No one approached. They did not want a risk association. You understood. People cling to security even when security is built on silence. Inside the elevator, the doors closed with a soft metallic echo. You allowed yourself one long breath. Not a breath of defeat, but a breath of recalibration. You were not 21. You were not a newcomer. You knew that power in corporate environments often hides behind titles and personas, but real leverage hides in information. And information was something you had in abundance. You remembered every approval you had seen. You remembered every discrepancy. You remembered the missing explanations. You remembered the tone in the CEO's voice when you first questioned the extra charges. People at your age do not forget details. They connect them. As the elevator descended, a thought formed slowly but firmly. They believed firing you would erase the questions. They believed removing you would silence the trail. They believed pushing you out would protect the people benefiting from the mysterious training allocations. They believed you would pack your box, drive home, complain to a friend, and eventually accept your fate. They believed maturity meant passivity. They believed experience meant resignation. They believed age made you predictable. They were wrong. When the doors opened, you stepped out into the lobby with a sense of purpose that felt heavier than the box in your hands. Every step you took toward the exit sharpened your thoughts. You were not angry. You were focused. Your mind was not replaying the CEO's tone. It was analyzing it. Your memory was not stuck on the paper they handed you. It was scanning the months leading up to it. Patterns emerged. Connections aligned. And with each new realization, you felt the beginnings of something powerful forming in your mind. Outside, the cold air touched your face. The parking lot shimmered with the early sun. You paused for a moment next to your car, letting the weight of the moment settle. People over 37 do not rush decisions. You processed everything calmly. You opened your trunk, placed your box inside, and closed it with quiet precision. Then you allowed yourself one final acknowledgement of the morning. Not regret. Not disappointment. Just truth. They fired you because you were the only one who did your job too well. They fired you because you looked too closely. They fired you because you were the wrong person to deceive. And that meant you held more power than they realized. You sat in your car, started the engine, and drove away with a promise resonating clearly in your mind. If they thought you would disappear quietly, they had severely underestimated the resolve of someone who had lived long enough to know that silence is not surrender. Silence is strategy. And yours had just begun. Experience teaches you many things, but the most valuable lesson you carried through your career was simple. Never rely on memory alone. People younger than you assume important details will stay fixed in their minds. People in their late 30s and beyond understand that memory is a place where truth can fade, but documents never forget. That is why, years before this moment, you had developed a habit that became second nature. Every decision, every contract, every approval, every financial fluctuation that crossed your desk was safely stored, organized, and recorded. It was not paranoia. It was discipline. And on the day they walked you out of the building, that discipline transformed into silent power. You drove home with a calmness that would have surprised anyone who did not understand the quiet confidence age brings. You placed the box on your dining table, took a moment to collect your thoughts, and then opened your laptop. You did not open it out of anger. You opened it with the clarity of someone who had seen enough corporate behavior to recognize patterns. You opened folders you had created long before trouble appeared. Each one contained material that mapped the truth your employer hoped you had forgotten. The first folder held your initial training budget reports. You had kept the original versions because something about the approved changes felt wrong even then. When you clicked through them, you found the inconsistencies immediately. The CEO had altered amounts without explanation. Certain vendor names appeared out of nowhere. Some invoices were identical in structure, but came from different addresses. You remembered questioning a few of these details months earlier. You remembered being told that the CEO had taken over certain decisions to streamline the process. At the time, you accepted the explanation because you believed clarity would eventually follow. Now you saw the truth. He had been preparing a narrative that blamed you while he quietly rerouted funds. The second folder contained emails. Not vague summaries or scattered messages, but carefully labeled communication chains saved from the start of the year. You had messages confirming that the CEO approved the private coaching sessions. You had messages proving he requested the inflated vendor services. You had messages where he insisted certain expenses be categorized under training, even when they clearly belonged elsewhere. The language was casual, but the intention was unmistakable. He had made those decisions. He had pushed those approvals. He had signed every document. As you scrolled through the emails, you felt no satisfaction. You felt steadiness. At 37 and beyond, satisfaction comes later. What you felt in that moment was alignment. The pieces were finally forming a picture. You remembered the expression on his face when he slid the paper across the conference table. He appeared calm because he believed the story would remain one-sided. He assumed the power of his title would overshadow the truth. He had forgotten something important. Titles can intimidate people who lack evidence. You did not. You opened the third folder. This one contained the expense reports from the last 8 months. You had copied them not out of suspicion, but because you had been asked to approve budget changes that felt disconnected from the actual training strategy. When you raised questions, the responses were brief and dismissive. You were told the CEO was taking responsibility for the new initiatives. You were expected to follow instructions and avoid unnecessary concerns. You accepted the order because you trusted the system. Today, you examined the numbers with fresh eyes. Certain expenses repeated in patterns that mirrored personal trips you remembered the CEO mentioning to colleagues. Specific dates aligned with locations that had nothing to do with corporate training. Meal expenses listed under development sessions matched times when you knew he was out of town. Hotel bookings approved as training workshops were identical to the ones his cousin's company regularly used. The deeper you looked, the clearer it became that the training budget had become a personal wallet disguised behind official terminology. You moved to the next folder. This one held physical copies of contracts you had scanned over time. You had a habit of saving them because your experience taught you that contracts often contain details others overlook. As you reviewed them, the surprising part was not their content. It was the sheer audacity behind them. Some contracts had no clear service descriptions. Some had signatures with dates that did not match the approval emails. Some contained identical wording despite being listed as different vendors. And every one of them contained the CEO's signature. Your name never appeared on the approval line. You leaned back in your chair and exhaled slowly. The truth was not complicated. It was simply buried under layers of corporate noise. They had removed you because you were the only one who had asked the right questions. They believed eliminating the questioner would eliminate the questions. They had not considered the possibility that you had already preserved every detail needed to expose their actions. As someone who had spent years managing projects, analyzing budgets, and leading teams, you knew how to interpret patterns. You also knew how to remain calm when faced with injustice. You did not act on impulse. You observed. You gathered. You verified. That was why you had not rushed into decisions during the elevator ride down from the conference room. You needed to see whether your instinct aligned with evidence. Now you had more than instinct. You had documentation strong enough to withstand scrutiny from any auditor, attorney, or board committee. You spent the next hour organizing the files into a clean timeline. You labeled everything by date, category, and approval source. You separated personal expenses disguised as training from legitimate costs. You marked every message that showed the CEO directing decisions. You created a folder specifically for inconsistencies. When you finished, you reviewed the structure from beginning to end. It was solid, clear, and irrefutable. As you worked, you remembered conversations from months earlier. You remembered the moment the CEO told the team he wanted more control over training decisions. You remembered the HR director advising you not to question the new vendors too much. You remembered subtle comments colleagues made about budget approvals happening late at night. At the time, these were small signals. Now, they formed the foundation of the truth they attempted to bury beneath your termination. You closed your laptop and looked at the box the company had allowed you to fill. To them, it contained a few notebooks, old certificates, and the framed photo from your first year at the company. To you, it symbolized the moment they miscalculated who they were dealing with. They believed you walked out carrying memories. You walked out carrying proof. That realization did not bring anger. It brought direction. Experience had taught you many things, but above all, it taught you to protect your integrity. Now you understood the role you would play in the days to come. You would not shout. You would not accuse blindly. You would not act out of bitterness. You would proceed with methodical precision, the same precision they underestimated when they assumed you were just another employee afraid to challenge authority. You placed the box aside and opened a fresh document, not to start a fight but to outline a plan. You listed the key findings. You summarized the inconsistencies. You noted the financial red flags. You prepared a concise description of how the training budget had been manipulated. You framed your notes in a language that any legal or financial expert could understand. You were not crafting revenge. You were crafting clarity. When you finished, you saved the file, backed it up twice, and closed your laptop with a steady hand. You looked around your home, the calm space that held your thoughts together, and felt a quiet certainty settle into your chest. They had fired you believing the story was over. They did not realize you were holding the pages they had forgotten to hide. You carried facts. You carried timelines. You carried signatures. You carried evidence. In short, you carried the one thing every corrupt executive fears the most. You carried proof. The first week after your dismissal felt strangely still, almost like the silence that settles over a house right after a storm. People who have lived past 35 know that silence does not mean defeat. Silence is space. Silence is the moment where you breathe deeply, look around, and decide whether the storm destroyed you or cleared a path you were too busy to see. You spent the first morning sitting at your dining table with a cup of coffee, staring at the sunlight hitting the window. Not once did you feel panic. Experience teaches you that panic is for people who never prepared. You were prepared long before they thought of pushing you out. Your phone buzzed throughout that first week with messages from former colleagues. Some sent short apologies, embarrassed by the way the meeting had unfolded. Some tried to explain that they had no power in the situation. Others spoke in hushed tones, blaming HR for following orders or blaming the CEO's nephew for orchestrating a quiet takeover. You listened without resentment because you had lived long enough to understand that many people choose survival over loyalty. You did not judge them. You simply observed. The nephew's sudden promotion into your role spread through the company, like smoke drifting under doors. You heard it from two colleagues on the same afternoon. They described the announcement as quick and uncomfortable. No one clapped. No one congratulated him. He walked into the department pretending confidence, but the staff avoided eye contact because everyone knew the truth. The decision had been made long before your review meeting. Your termination was not about performance. It was about clearing a seat someone wanted badly enough to remove anyone standing in the way. On your side of the world, the days were slow but deliberate. Each morning you opened your laptop and revisited the documents you had organized. You reviewed emails, studied reports, and charted timelines. You checked dates, signatures, and entries that made no sense unless someone was intentionally hiding expenses. You discovered that several training events billed to the company never actually happened. Travel charges for development trips matched receipts for personal vacations. Vendor payments aligned with weekends rather than scheduled sessions. The more you examined, the more obvious it became that the budget had been manipulated with the assumption that no one would look closely. You took notes carefully, grouping findings into categories: misallocated expenses, duplicate invoices, unauthorized service charges, suspicious vendor relationships. Every entry you reviewed reinforced the same conclusion. They had used you as a shield long enough. When you stopped being convenient, they removed you. But they underestimated how quietly someone over 37 can move while gathering facts that speak louder than accusations. As the weeks passed, the calls from former colleagues became more frequent. Some had questions about specific tasks you used to manage. Some seemed worried about the company's direction under the nephew's leadership. A few hinted that the CEO looked increasingly tense, especially after the finance department questioned the sudden shift in training costs. One colleague mentioned whispers circulating about budget discrepancies uncovered during an internal review. You said little. You listened. People often reveal more when they believe you are no longer part of the equation. Your home became a quiet headquarters. You worked without noise, without anger, and without haste. You refined your timeline, making sure each inconsistency connected clearly to a decision made by the CEO or approved through HR. You triple-checked signatures, emails, and timestamps. You eliminated anything that did not meet your standard for credibility. Years of professional discipline guided every step you took. You were not interested in creating a story. You were interested in presenting the truth without exaggeration, without emotion, and without gaps. Meanwhile, you paid attention to the emotional landscape within the company. One colleague confided that the nephew avoided questions during team meetings. Another revealed that the CEO had stopped attending certain briefings, delegating responsibilities inconsistently as tension grew. The HR director reportedly asked the staff to limit internal emails to essential communication only. That request alone revealed more than anyone realized. People who fear exposure often try to reduce written traces. Through all of this, you maintained your routine. You woke up early, exercised, prepared meals, and managed your time with the calm discipline that only maturity brings. You gave yourself hours each day to review your findings and then stepped away to ensure your mind stayed sharp. You refused to let bitterness cloud your thinking. Experience had taught you that clarity grows in calm environments, not in chaotic emotional reactions. One afternoon, you sat at your desk reviewing a cluster of vendor invoices and noticed a subtle detail you had overlooked. Several payments were made to a consulting firm that did not appear in internal training schedules. The amounts were substantial and repeated at consistent intervals. A quick search revealed that the address connected to the firm matched a small property associated with the CEO's cousin. That single discovery connected multiple pieces of evidence into a cohesive pattern. The budget had not simply been mismanaged. It had been siphoned strategically. You documented the pattern and saved the evidence carefully. With every step, the truth sharpened until it formed a complete picture. You realized you had more than enough to raise concerns with any regulatory office, financial auditor, or legal authority. But you also understood the importance of timing. People over 37 learned that timing is often more powerful than force. Acting too quickly could compromise the impact of your findings. Acting too slowly could allow them to rewrite the narrative. You needed precision. The turning point came during a brief conversation with an old colleague who still respected you deeply. He told you that 2 managers had been asking questions about the training reports you used to prepare. He said the nephew appeared overwhelmed and unprepared to handle responsibilities he never earned. He added that the CEO had been unusually silent during leadership discussions. You listened carefully and asked a few calm questions. That conversation confirmed what you already suspected. Pressure was building inside the company. Cracks were forming, and the people responsible were beginning to feel the weight of their choices. After that call, you closed your laptop and walked to the window, watching the afternoon light settle across the street. You stood still for a long moment, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. You thought about the years you dedicated to the company, the trust you had built, the discipline you had maintained, and the quiet professionalism that had defined your role. You understood now that your dismissal had been a strategic move, but also a mistake. They assumed removing you would hide their trail. Instead, it gave you the space to connect all the pieces they tried to bury. You returned to your desk, opened a fresh document, and wrote a short list. The first item was clear and deliberate. Hire an attorney. Not just any attorney. You needed someone who understood corporate misconduct better than the CEO understood profit margins. You needed a professional with experience in financial irregularities, workplace terminations, and internal corruption. Someone who would not be intimidated by corporate titles. Someone who would know exactly how to use your evidence without exposing you prematurely. You researched quietly, reading reviews, scanning profiles, and noting lawyers who specialized in cases similar to yours. When you found one whose expertise matched every requirement, you scheduled a consultation. There was no rush, no anxiety, just readiness. During the days leading up to the meeting, you refined your notes again, ensuring that your findings were clear, factual, and organized. You prepared a summary of the events leading to your dismissal. You prepared extracts of the most critical evidence. You prepared questions to ask. You acted with the steady confidence of someone who had lived long enough to understand the importance of preparation. The quiet weeks that followed your termination were not empty. They were strategic. They were filled with deliberate steps, careful analysis, and a calm determination that only people who have lived through enough challenges can cultivate. While they believed you were staying home devastated, you were building a foundation stronger than anything they expected. You did not make noise. You made a plan. And when the time came to execute it, you knew the company would realize their biggest mistake was not firing you. Their biggest mistake was assuming you would stay defeated. The lawyer you chose did not waste time. He reviewed your documents with the calm focus of someone who had spent years taking apart corporate lies one detail at a time. He asked precise questions, studied the timeline you created, and nodded slowly as you explained the sequence of events leading up to your dismissal. When the meeting ended, he said he would send one letter. You expected pages of arguments, legal references, and explanations. Instead, he crafted a message so concise it surprised you. Experience teaches older professionals that power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a simple statement delivered by the right person. The letter demanded a review of the financial decisions associated with the training budget and requested immediate preservation of internal records. That was all it took. The company received the letter early on a Monday morning. By noon, panic had already begun to ripple through the executive floor. You heard about it from a friend who still worked there. He said the CEO looked pale, the nephew stayed locked in his office, and HR seemed confused by the unexpected escalation. They had believed firing you would close the issue. They had believed your departure would silence every question. Now they were faced with something they did not anticipate. They were not dealing with an emotional former employee. They were dealing with documented proof backed by legal expertise. The board convened an emergency meeting 2 days later. They agreed to open an internal audit, expecting it to clear the leadership quickly. They imagined a smooth, controlled process that would confirm their CEO's explanations and reassure investors. Instead, the moment the auditors began examining the budget, inconsistencies emerged like cracks spreading through old concrete. The first discrepancy appeared in the form of repeated vendor charges with no record of actual training sessions. Then came discoveries of duplicate invoices and payments issued on dates that did not match internal schedules. Small details at first, but enough to raise suspicion. The auditors expanded their review. Within a week, the internal audit revealed connections they could not ignore. Several vendor accounts appeared linked to a single address. The auditors traced the address to a rental property owned by the CEO's cousin. Payments listed as coaching services corresponded to weekends the CEO spent traveling with friends. Hotel bookings labeled as professional development matched family vacation spots. Even flight itineraries categorized as training trips aligned with personal destinations. The evidence grew heavier each day, pressing against the structure of lies the CEO had constructed. You did not celebrate. People over 37 learned that vindication is not a moment of applause. It is a quiet breath of recognition. You watch the situation unfold from a distance, observing the company unravel the same thread you had identified weeks earlier. You reviewed updates from your lawyer, who communicated with the auditors through formal channels. You did not reach out to former colleagues. You did not post anything online. You maintained silence because silence kept you safe. Meanwhile, inside the company, the tension became impossible to ignore. The HR director, who had signed off on every questionable approval, suddenly took medical leave. People whispered that she looked shaken during her last meeting before disappearing. Some believed she feared becoming the primary target. Others believed she had been pressured to step back to avoid drawing attention. Whatever the reason, her departure left a gap that could not be hidden. HR became unstable, and employees began questioning decisions made over the past year. The CFO, once known for her confident smile and polished presence, stopped attending informal gatherings. She no longer greeted staff with warmth in the hallways. She began canceling meetings and redirecting inquiries to junior accountants. Reports suggested she had grown tense and defensive, especially when asked about financial oversight. She knew the numbers. She understood the implications. Every misallocated dollar pointed toward a failure in her department or a deception she failed to detect. Each day that passed increased the pressure she carried. As the internal audit expanded, the board realized the situation was larger than they initially imagined. Investors were beginning to ask questions about the rising tension within the company. Rumors circulated among staff that legal departments were preparing for potential regulatory inquiries. The nephew, who had slipped into your former role, struggled to maintain control. He appeared overwhelmed, often leaving meetings early or avoiding direct questions about the training department. His lack of expertise was exposed quickly, and employees noticed his uneasiness. Your lawyer received updates from the audit team confirming that the investigation had moved beyond the training budget. They were now reviewing company credit card usage, vendor relationships, and recent executive approvals. The deeper they looked, the more connections they uncovered. Fake vendor accounts, inflated service charges, unauthorized travel expenses. The audit team began assembling a detailed report outlining the scope of the misconduct. Hours later, your phone rang. The name on the screen surprised you. It was one of the senior board members, someone who had barely acknowledged you during your years at the company. He spoke with forced warmth, informing you that they hoped to resolve the internal confusion and would greatly appreciate your cooperation. You listened patiently, holding the phone to your ear, without speaking for several seconds. The silence unsettled him. He cleared his throat twice and attempted to sound friendly. You ended the call by saying you would think about it. That evening, you sat outside on your balcony watching the sky shift from gold to blue. You remembered the meeting where they fired you, the coldness in the room, the way the CEO avoided your eyes, the way the managers remained still, afraid to breathe. You remembered your own composure as you stood up and walked away. You had given them respect for years. They returned it with humiliation. And now, weeks later, with the investigation tightening around them, they reached out to you not out of kindness, but out of fear. People over 37 often reach a moment where dignity outweighs emotion. You had reached that moment a long time ago. You decided to respond on your terms. The next day, you informed your lawyer of the messages. He nodded thoughtfully, already predicting their approach. He advised you to accept a meeting, but only after allowing enough time for the board to feel the weight of your silence. So you waited 3 more days. During that time, the company sent another email and another phone call. When you finally agreed, they sounded relieved, almost grateful. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at a neutral location, a quiet conference room in a private office building downtown. You arrived early, composed and steady. You carried a folder containing the most essential documents, organized in a way that told a story without needing a single emotional explanation. When the board members walked in, they looked more tense than you had ever seen them. Their suits seemed tighter, their faces drawn, their steps cautious. You greeted them politely and took your seat. They exchanged awkward glances, as if unsure how to begin. Older professionals know this feeling well. It is the moment when people who once believed they held power realize they no longer control the direction of the conversation. One board member cleared his throat and tried to appear confident. He thanked you for agreeing to meet and explained that the company was facing significant concerns due to the ongoing audit. He spoke slowly, choosing each word as if he feared saying too much. Another board member leaned forward and asked if you could provide context about certain training expenses. They wanted clarification. They wanted guidance. They wanted reassurance that you would cooperate in helping them understand the discrepancies. You listened without interrupting. Their eagerness was almost uncomfortable to watch. They had expected you to walk into this room fragile, emotional, perhaps desperate for validation. They expected gratitude for being included. Instead, you sat with straight posture, calm expression, and an energy that reminded them they were the ones who had come seeking answers. When they finished speaking, you opened your folder. You placed several documents on the table, arranging them neatly in front of you. You did not raise your voice. You did not show anger. You simply presented facts. You explained the timeline of approvals, the contracts linked to the CEO's cousin, the invoices that matched personal trips, and the inconsistent signatures scattered across the financial documents. You pointed to specific dates and amounts with firm precision. You described how the training budget had been manipulated long before your dismissal. As you spoke, the room grew still. The board members watched the documents like they were staring at the pieces of a puzzle they had been too distracted to assemble. One of them scribbled notes rapidly. Another rubbed his chin with a trembling hand. A third leaned back in her chair, blinking slowly as the truth formed in her mind. You could sense the shift. The narrative they once believed had collapsed under the weight of your evidence. When you finished, you slid the remaining documents forward. You told them calmly that every piece of information had been verified, time-stamped, and preserved. You explained that you had not come to accuse anyone personally. You had come to present the truth. Your lawyer sat beside you, silent but observant, ensuring every word was documented. The board exchanged looks of disbelief and concern. One member asked if you would be willing to help them navigate the next steps in the investigation. Another asked if you would consider returning to the company in an advisory role. You felt the irony settle in your chest. The same people who allowed your dismissal without hesitation were now inviting you back as if the past never occurred. You responded with measured calm. You told them you would consider their requests, but only after reviewing the full scope of their intentions. You reminded them that you had been treated unjustly and that your expertise had been dismissed without reason. You did not need to express anger. Your presence alone reminded them of their mistake. After the meeting, you walked out of the building with the same steady confidence you carried when you left the company weeks earlier. The board had expected you to return broken, apologetic, perhaps eager to reclaim a position. Instead, they encountered a version of you they had underestimated. You had clarity. You had strength. You had control. You spent the next few days in reflection. You considered the board's requests carefully. You understood the strategic advantage you held. They believed cooperation would be simple. They believed offering you inclusion would soften the truth. They did not realize that dignity cannot be negotiated. People your age know the value of self-respect. You weighed your options with consideration, not emotion. When the board reached out again, their tone was even more anxious. They asked for a follow-up meeting, hoping to finalize your involvement. You agreed. At the second meeting, you clarified your conditions. You wanted transparency. You wanted corrective action. Most importantly, you wanted acknowledgement of the wrongdoing. The board members nodded repeatedly, eager to secure your participation. They seemed to understand that your presence could stabilize the company at a time when trust was vanishing. As the meeting ended, one of them finally asked why you had waited so long to respond to their initial messages. You smiled slightly and answered with the wisdom that comes from years of navigating professional environments. You told them that silence teaches people how much they need you. The room grew quiet. They understood. You left that day knowing the balance of power had shifted. They once believed you were disposable. Now they understood you were essential. You had walked into the meeting with nothing but truth organized on paper. They had walked in with fear disguised as polite inquiry. In the end, the evidence spoke louder than any emotion you could have expressed. And that was your victory. The morning of the vote felt strangely calm. You woke early, brewed coffee, and sat by the window watching light slowly push through the clouds. There was no rush in your movements, no nervousness in your chest. People who are over 37 understand that important days often arrive quietly. The anxiety belongs to those who are unprepared. You had prepared for weeks. When your phone buzzed with a message from your lawyer confirming the time of the board vote, you simply nodded to yourself and finished your coffee. At the company headquarters, tension was thick enough to feel before you even approached the entrance. Employees hovered near the elevators, speaking in soft tones. Some clutched folders as if they were shields. Others stared at their phones, pretending to be busy. The news of the vote had reached every corner of the building, though no one dared speak openly. You stepped inside with steady confidence, aware that your presence alone stirred whispers. People who once walked past you without acknowledgement now lowered their voices when you approached. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was charged. Members sat stiffly, papers organized in front of them like fragile defenses against the gravity of their decision. You took a seat near the back of the room with your lawyer by your side. You felt the weight of what was about to happen, not as pressure, but as recognition. You had uncovered the truth. You had presented a merger that promised stability. And now the board had to choose between protecting a failing leader or protecting the future of the company. The vote began without ceremony. One by one, each board member raised a hand. There were no hesitations, no bargaining, no last-minute attempts to save the CEO. When the final hand lifted, the decision became official. The CEO was removed pending further investigation. A statement was drafted immediately for investors. Another was prepared for internal staff. The board members sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the shock of their own decision. Then they began discussing next steps, already shifting their attention toward implementation of the merger you had proposed. You watched them quietly, feeling neither triumph nor anger. People your age understand that justice is rarely loud. It is a steady shift, a slow correction of something that had been wrong for far too long. You stood to leave the room, and one board member approached you to thank you for your cooperation. His tone was respectful in a way you had never heard before. You nodded politely, knowing gratitude would mean nothing without action. Meanwhile, the CEO had been escorted out of his office to meet with legal representatives. One colleague later told you that he looked stunned, as if he had never imagined his position could be taken from him. That was the problem. People in power often believe they are untouchable until the ground shifts beneath them. The investigators had enough evidence to freeze his accounts, seize his company devices, and initiate a formal inquiry. His departure was quiet, but not unnoticed. Employees observed from behind their screens, pretending to work while witnessing the fall of the man who once believed authority belonged only to him. The aftermath rippled quickly through the building. HR scrambled to rewrite their narratives. The same HR director who had signed paperwork supporting your dismissal now pretended she had been unaware of the CEO's actions. She circulated messages emphasizing transparency and employee support. People older than 37 can detect insincerity instantly. Her sudden shift did nothing to erase the truth. Everyone knew she had followed the CEO's orders without question. Her role in the scandal was too significant to hide. Within days, she requested extended leave. Most knew she would not return. The nephew resigned next. His departure came through a brief announcement circulated by email. He cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue new opportunities. No one believed it, but no one challenged it either. His resignation felt like the final crack in a facade that had been collapsing for months. He had wanted your position desperately, and for a short moment, he held it. But the moment scrutiny arrived, he found himself exposed. Your departure had not protected him. It had destroyed every illusion he clung to. As he walked out of the building, employees whispered that he left with boxes filled mostly with unread reports he had never understood. The CFO approached you on your first day back. Her handshake was firm, her smile carefully constructed, but her eyes revealed the truth. She was afraid. She had been too close to the financial decisions that were now under review. She had not spoken up when the numbers began to shift. She had not questioned the invoices that made no sense. Now she faced the consequences. She needed your cooperation to protect the company's financial structure. She needed you more than she cared to admit. You responded with the same calm professionalism you always carried. You said nothing that suggested friendship. You simply noted that restructuring would require complete transparency. When you walked through the building as a partner for the first time, the reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People lifted their heads from their screens as though they were seeing someone they had once known in another lifetime. You are not the employee who walked out weeks earlier carrying a box of personal belongings. You are not the person who sat silently during meetings while others took credit for your work. You were not the individual dismissed without hesitation. You were the person whose documentation exposed the truth. You were the person who brought the merger that could save the company. You were the person with authority granted not through favoritism, but through integrity. That kind of power carries a different weight in corporate spaces. People felt it the moment you stepped into the hallway. Managers who once avoided your presence now stood when you entered a room. They offer greetings with care, choosing their words with precision. You notice the change, but did not react emotionally. People over 37 understand that respect gained through fear is temporary. Respect gained through competency, resilience, and truth holds longer. You moved through the floors meeting department heads, analyzing systems, and evaluating the processes damaged by the previous leadership. Every time you asked a question, people responded quickly, eager to demonstrate compliance. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted completely. You sat at the table now not as a guest, but as a partner. You contributed to strategy discussions, clarified operational weaknesses, and outlined steps for the merger transition. Your presence kept the conversation grounded. The board members deferred to you on decisions involving internal structure. They recognized that you understood the daily mechanics of the company better than any of them. They recognized that you had survived the worst of their previous leadership and returned stronger. During one meeting, you reviewed the projected timeline for the merger. The board looked to you for approval. Their trust was unmistakable. You gave clear recommendations, and the meeting proceeded smoothly. As you spoke, you noticed how some managers glanced at you with a mixture of respect and apprehension. They remembered the day you were dismissed. They remembered the silence in the room. They remembered how easily they had looked away. Now they understood how deeply they had misjudged you. The building itself felt transformed. Conversations were more cautious. Reports were submitted with greater detail. Emails were written with professionalism rather than arrogance. Employees who once dismissed the importance of procedure now followed it carefully. Not because they feared punishment, but because your presence reminded them that structure matters. Integrity matters. And someone was finally watching. Your leadership brought a quiet order to the chaos. You did not raise your voice. You did not threaten anyone. You simply asked the right questions at the right time. And people responded. You had become the person they feared not because of aggression, but because of truth. People who lied feared you. People who schemed feared you. People who ignored responsibility feared you. But the honest ones respected you deeply. You walked into the company as an overlooked employee and returned as the person holding the threads of its future. And everyone knew it. When you look back now, you realize the ending was never about winning loudly. It was about arriving quietly at a moment that belonged entirely to you. There was no triumphant music, no applause, no celebration. The most important victories in life rarely come with noise. They come with a soft click of a pen closing after a signature. They come with the steady breath you release when you know you have done what is right. They come with the stillness of a room that once rejected you, but now waits for your decisions. The day you signed the merger document was exactly that kind of moment. Not a loud rise. A quiet arrival. You walked into the boardroom that morning with calm steps, carrying the same folder you had carried through your entire journey. It was the folder that once held the evidence of wrongdoing. It now held the blueprint for the company's future. You were not nervous. People over 35 understand that nerves are for situations you have not prepared for. You had prepared in ways the board could not imagine. As you sat down, the board members watched you with a respect that had not existed months earlier. They knew that without your persistence, the company would have been swallowed by scandal. They knew that your silence during the worst moments had been the reason you survived them. They knew that the person they had pushed aside had returned with more authority than the entire executive team. Signing the merger document felt like closing the door to an earlier version of yourself. You remembered the day they fired you, but only as a distant shadow that no longer carried weight. You did not feel the humiliation anymore. You did not feel the shock. Those emotions had faded into memory, replaced by clarity. The day of your firing had been the moment you shed the final layer of your old identity. The day of your signing was the moment you stepped fully into the person you had been becoming quietly, patiently, and steadily. You did not destroy anyone to get here. That is what made the victory meaningful. You simply replaced systems that no longer worked. You replaced people who chose shortcuts over ethics. You replaced the leadership that had confused authority with arrogance. You replaced the version of yourself that tolerated disrespect. You replaced chaos with order. You replaced weakness with preparation. And most importantly, you replaced noise with proof. That is the difference maturity brings. When you are young, you think proving yourself requires confrontation. When you are older, you learn that proving yourself requires evidence. Power becomes something very different after 35. It stops being the ability to raise your voice or intimidate others. It becomes the ability to stay calm when everyone else panics. It becomes the ability to see what others miss because you have lived long enough to recognize patterns. It becomes the patience to wait for the right moment instead of forcing the wrong one. And you had done exactly that. Every step you took since the day they dismissed you had been guided by patience. You had watched the investigation unfold. You had watched the lies unravel. You had watched the board struggle with the consequences of their earlier decisions. And you had waited. People your age understand the value of waiting. Waiting gives clarity. Waiting gives leverage. Waiting gives you room to think instead of react. While the company panicked, you organized. While the CEO scrambled, you planned. While HR rewrote narratives, you preserved truth. While the nephew resigned quietly, you prepared your merger. Waiting had been your strategy, not your weakness. And the board realized this when they saw the smooth precision of your proposal. The moment they accepted your terms, the balance of power shifted permanently. They did not fully grasp the extent of your influence until they watched you begin to make changes. You approached leadership differently than those who came before you. You did not rely on fear. You relied on structure. You did not manipulate. You clarified. You did not attempt to impress people. You impressed systems into functioning correctly. And that difference changed everything inside the company. You implemented new financial controls to ensure that every transaction matched a legitimate purpose. You established checks that would catch discrepancies long before they could grow into scandals. You met with department heads individually, understanding their concerns and guiding them through transparent processes. You rebuilt trust not by speeches but by predictability. Employees knew that if they followed protocol, you would support them. If they asked questions, you would answer honestly. If they raised concerns, you would listen. It was leadership built not from charisma, but from consistency. Your age changed the way you approached every decision. You no longer felt the need to rush into solutions. You took your time to analyze problems from all sides. You requested reports, reviewed details, and asked for clarity where others might have assumed understanding. You delegated tasks thoughtfully, choosing the right people and giving them room to grow. Younger leaders often rely on urgency. You relied on precision, and that precision began to restore the company's foundation. Employees noticed the shift. Meetings became calmer. Deadlines became manageable. Communication improved. The atmosphere no longer felt tense or unpredictable. Even the board began to breathe easier, realizing that the company was settling into a rhythm it had not seen in years. Investors expressed renewed confidence, citing the transparency you introduced. Clients returned. Opportunities reopened. The company was healing under your guidance. And through all of this, you carried the lesson that defined your entire journey. Power is not noise. Power is proof. Proof of competence. Proof of preparation. Proof of discipline. Proof of understanding how systems work. Proof of knowing how to protect yourself when others attempt to erase you. Proof that the person who stays calm in chaos becomes the one everyone turns to when chaos becomes unbearable. People often asked you if you ever felt the desire to retaliate against those who wronged you. You answered with honesty. You told them that retaliation is a young person's game. Retaliation is noisy, emotional, reactive. What you pursued was resolution, not revenge. Resolution meant creating something stronger than what had been broken. Resolution meant proving that the truth always outlasts the noise. Resolution meant building a future where the mistakes of the past could never be repeated. There came a moment months later when you ran into one of the managers who had been present the day of your firing. He approached you carefully, unsure how you would react. He apologized softly, explaining that he regretted staying silent. You listened with understanding, knowing that fear often makes people small. You did not carry resentment toward him or anyone else in that room. They had been part of your old chapter. You were living in the new one. You wished him well and walked away. That moment reminded you of something you had learned slowly over the years. The best revenge is not humiliation. The best revenge is success wrapped in silence. The best revenge is walking into a room with authority built from truth. The best revenge is creating systems that prevent the wrongs you endured from happening to others. The best revenge is becoming the person they never imagined you could become, not to spite them, but to honor yourself. In the end, your journey taught you the deepest truth anyone over 35 eventually learns. Power does not come from raising your voice. Power comes from raising your standards. Power comes from preparation so thorough that no one can rewrite your narrative. Power comes from understanding rules so completely that those who use them against you eventually become bound by them. Power comes from knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. Your silence rebuilt your future. Your patience reshaped the company. Your proof restored your name. And the final victory arrived quietly, professionally, and completely. Because the sweetest revenge is not noise. It is finality.